And going into tonight, Joe Biden had 670 and Bernie Sanders had 574. So will the Joe-mentum continue tonight? The polls just closed in the Wolverine state, and the Fox News decision desk can now project that the former Vice President Joe Biden will beat Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders in the crucial state of Michigan, which Sanders won 4 years ago. The Fox projection is also based on our polling of both early voters and those who cast their ballots today, as well as data from sample precincts. As you can see there, Fox News decision desk can also project that former Vice President Joe Biden will easily win Mississippi, which is pretty much what most people thought heading into tonight. And in Missouri, the Fox News decision desk can project that Biden will also sail to victory there. So is it still too early to project a winner in North Dakota, or it's too early there? But we've got an all-star lineup to break down the results as they come in tonight. We've got Tom Bevan, president and co-founder of Real Clear Politics, Lincoln Mitchell, former Democratic campaign consultant and political science professor at Columbia University, and Brad Blakeman, former senior advisor to President George W. Bush. So, Tom, obviously now we've seen the results of, at least Michigan, which was the big contest. But before we get into those results, I want to talk about how we got here tonight. Have you ever seen a candidate rebound like Joe Biden has?
I haven't. I mean, people have been talking and searching for some historical analogy, but we really have never seen the comeback in such a rapid fashion. I mean, literally in 72 hours, Joe Biden went from a dead man walking politically to basically the front runner for the nomination. And now after tonight will certainly, almost certainly be the nominee, barring some sort of catastrophic event for his campaign. And we haven't seen anything like that. He's the same guy. It's not like he retooled his campaign. It's not like he's changed his message. He's the same guy today that he was 10 days ago when voters were basically shunning him, finishing 4th and 5th, and really until that switch. But, the Biden strategy all along was just wait for my firewall in South Carolina, wait for African-American voters. And they really did come through for him. And that, when you look at the results from tonight, too, while Bernie was able to do well with Latinos in Nevada, he has not done well with African-American voters, and that's been the difference in a lot of these states.
But, Lincoln, that was kind of a risky strategy because, I mean, you lose the first 3 contests heading into South Carolina. It could have been disastrous. Sanders could have had the win at his back, but Biden was able to pull it off. Why?
Well, his strategy was not to lose that badly in the first 2, and even in Nevada. His strategy was to do a little better there. One thing that happened here, if you had fallen asleep around Thanksgiving and woken up the day after Super Tuesday, this race would have gone exactly as you thought, right? But there was a lot of turmoil in between. One thing that strikes me is that a lot of these candidates didn't seem to have a plan, right? Buttigieg's plan was to do well in Iowa and then kind of hope to get lucky. They didn't. We talk a lot about Sanders not doing his work and not getting inroads with African-American voters, but nobody did. And Harris and Booker, who were positioned to do that, probably dropped out too early. So this was a very strange race, a massive field, and when the field is that big to begin with, it's very hard to break through. So name recognition matters a lot, and Biden, as the former vice president for 8 years, starts out with that massive name recognition. So does Sanders because of his run in 2016. One thing that strikes me is that from that massive field, if you're a Democrat, to be stuck with these two, unless you're a hardline Bernie bro, even if you are an establishment centrist, there were so many other establishment centrists who were more dynamic and would have been better general election candidates.
Like
Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, John Hickenlooper, who dropped out very early and is now running for the Senate, Jay Inslee. These would have all been better general election candidates. But they couldn't get through that first threshold, which was to raise the money, and they couldn't break through with the name recognition. And Joe Biden had that great week, beginning with the big debate and then Clyburn's endorsement. The last thing is Bloomberg's entrance into the race took the heat off Biden. He was no longer the kind of centrist or, in the context of the Democratic Party, right-wing foil. Bloomberg was. So people stopped picking on Biden going into South Carolina. That probably helped him, too.
So Brad, Lincoln said some of the candidates probably dropped out too early. What do you think was behind that? I mean, what do you think was happening behind the scenes? We all know how politics works. Who do you think was making those calls? What do you think was behind the scenes to get Pete Buttigieg to drop out, endorse Biden, get Amy Klobuchar to drop out, endorse Biden? What's behind that?
Money.
But Buttigieg was raising money.
Yeah, but the others weren't able to raise the money in order to continue. You have to have money. Money is the lifeblood of business. It's the lifeblood of politics. And when it starts to dry up, you can't get on the air. You can't compete on the ground. So as soon as that money dries up and you don't live to fight another day, you have no choice but to drop out. It costs a lot of money to run. And when you're running on many fronts, as we've seen with Super Tuesday, 14 venues, look at Biden's return on investment compared to Bloomberg. He spent next to nothing, and now he's running the tables. I was just looking at the spending in Michigan. You know, Bloomberg spent
over... Just for those at home, we see Michigan right now, 60%. Reporting Biden up 454,000 votes, 385 with 53%. That's 60% reporting right now. So
Bloomberg was out of the race, and he still beat them all in spending $6 million. The last cycle, all the Democrats spent together $10 million. And with Biden, the establishment got scared when Biden started to falter and fail. They saw a deep pocket candidate, Bloomberg. They put their bet on Bloomberg. Bloomberg, something the establishment wanted, but the people rejected, and Bloomberg was out.
Lincoln?
I would just be a little bit, I don't think the Democratic establishment wanted Bloomberg. I think they were very much seduced by his money. But they didn't.
Well, they still will be.
They didn't really want.
They're still going to be. I have a projection. They're still going to take it.
So they will. They will. It's still out there. But also none of the other candidates. I mean, Buttigieg or Klobuchar could have owned that establishment lane. Kamala Harris was about as poorly served as political consultants as I've seen of any Democratic candidate in modern times. This lane should have been hers, because she is a great speaker. She is the kind of perfect profile to win this. She's a fresh face, and she couldn't break through. She hadn't thought things through. The strategy, she should have been living in South Carolina starting in mid-2019. She should have been owning that Southern African-American vote, which is heavily female. If she does that, Biden is done. And the establishment, for whatever that exactly means, very much could have lived with a Kamala Harris.
But how do you overcome the endorsement of the congressman?
No, I'm saying if had things gone differently in mid-2019, that wouldn't have been an issue. By the time Clyburn, by 2020 rolls around, of course Clyburn's going to Biden.
Right.
She lost South Carolina last summer.
But Tom, what about, so Biden's campaign has been fueled by African-American voters. We saw that in South Carolina, even in the state of Mississippi tonight, which we've got 12% reporting, Biden with 81.7% as it stands right now. But you look at a state like Mississippi, so going back to 2016, over 71% of the electorate is African-American. That's really what's been fueling his campaign. So what do they see in him? Why do you think he is garnering that kind of support with African-Americans?
I think it's nostalgia, and it's his affiliation with Obama. It is interesting that, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris couldn't make that connection, and I disagree a little bit. I mean, Kamala Harris, voters gave her a look after that first debate. I mean, she really popped in the polls. She had momentum. She couldn't sustain it. Elizabeth Warren got a look, and how different might this race have been if Michael Bloomberg either hadn't gone on that debate stage, had waited it out, or had gone on there and actually performed competently. So all of these candidates failed for one reason or another, but it's not like they didn't have a chance. It's not like they didn't have their moment in the sun to convince voters, but ultimately they failed for one reason or another.
Lincoln, hold that thought right now. We've got Fox News' Jackie Heinrich, and she is live in Cleveland tonight, where the Sanders campaign rally was also canceled. Jackie, what's going on there? And also, what's the mood like right now? I mean, Sanders is having a tough night.
Yeah, well, going back to the event being canceled, that was pretty eerie. I mean, we were standing outside of the convention center, and they were taking down the red, white, and blue bunting. Staffers were trying to figure out where they were going to go to kind of watch the results come in. So nobody really expected this, and the campaign tells us that they were in the car on the way to the hotel when the senator actually made the decision after he saw the information coming from the state of Ohio asking for athletics not to have any spectators given the risks of coronavirus. They said that was the information they needed to know that they had to cancel tonight. So that being said, now that we're seeing all the results come in, it's kind of hard to get, a pulse on how it's being received, since nobody is here, gathered to witness this. And it's clear that for Sanders, African-American voters are turning out to pretty much be the Achilles heel of his campaign. He's failing to get broad support among that demographic. He, lost Mississippi and Missouri, a repeat of 2016 when he lost both those states to Hillary Clinton. He was asked today, I think the writing was sort of on the wall there, given how well Joe Biden was doing with southern states and on Super Tuesday, especially coming out of South Carolina. He was asked, the senator, is there a path to the nomination without the support of Southern black voters? And his answer was that he hadn't really thought about it, but he did think that there were still ways to get to the convention with more delegates than Biden. So while we know that he's got he's been wounded tonight with the events, with the results that are coming in, especially with Michigan. It may not be the time to count him out quite yet because we don't know the delegate split. And of course, a week from today, we've got 4 more states that have even more delegates up for grabs. I believe it is 577 compared to today's 352. So we will wait and see how this shakes out at the end of it. But at least where things stand right now, definitely disappointing results for Sanders tonight.
Also,
Lisa?
Jackie, astute point of it being hard to gauge the crowd if there is no crowd. So I feel you that. But are you hearing? Have you heard from? Yeah, makes a lot of sense, you know. But are you hearing from anyone on the Sanders campaign? Have you heard from anyone, you know, in the past like 15, 20 minutes?
You know, they've been kind of tight-lipped about, you know, giving any sort of comment before the results are finalized. And we know that he was in the air flying back to Burlington, actually on a plane for at least the first part of this evening. So haven't heard anything very recently, but, you know, he was talking earlier today, Sanders was, and then his campaign officials, about how what's happened today really isn't a loss because of the huge movement that they have built around the campaign. All these people, especially, they were hammering home that point about the billionaires. That's his talking point now, is that Biden's part of the establishment, his campaign is funded by billionaires, and that's, you know, his sort of last-ditch effort to revive his campaign is to really paint that difference between who does America want to be running the country? Do they want, you know, someone that represents the people, which is what the Sanders campaign is arguing, or do they want more of the same, which they, you know, depict as being funded by Wall Street? And that's the message that they're going to stick to coming out of this. Lisa?
Jackie, thanks so much. We appreciate you being with us. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so Lincoln, for what we just heard, I mean, the Sanders, you know, still optimistic, thinking, you know, that anti-establishment versus establishment dynamic is going to work for him. Is the optimism necessary, or is it?
Well, it's not going to work for him.
Yeah.
I mean, Sanders, going back to 2016 as well, built his campaign both these times on 2 pillars. One is a battery of what he calls socialist, but we just say left of center economic ideas, whether that's involving healthcare, education, other taxation policy, other programs. Those policies are very popular among Democratic voters. The second pillar is this war on the Democratic establishment. And the problem is Democrats like the establishment. Nancy Pelosi is very popular. And when you go to Africa, for just as a symbol of the establishment, the Obamas, another symbol of the establishment, extremely popular. And when you go to African American communities, the Democratic establishment is their elected officials, and often among the most powerful and hard-fighting voices in their community. So if you go to Detroit or Mississippi and say the problem is the establishment, people are going to look around and say, that's my city council member, that's my state legislator. Once he started making that war, Bernie's not a young man, as you may have seen from some of the clippings here.
I don't know if I believe that.
Well, who knows? Could be fake news. But when he talks about the establishment, you feel like he's stuck in 1962 when he's talking about Meade Esposito and Dick Daley. The world has changed, and building this on the fight against the establishment was a mistake.
But you mentioned, though, the Medicare for All aspect of this. And what I find interesting, Tom, is because when you do look at the exit polling, I mean, Democratic primary voters, they do support Medicare for All. So what's the disconnect between, you know, some of the Democratic primary voters believing, you know, one of the key pillars of his campaign, but not necessarily supporting him in some of these primary contests?
Yeah, I mean,
what's that disconnect?
Bernie's always been the rift that is shown is more age-based than anything. I mean, he gets.
But he does well with young voters,
he does,
which is,
he does very well with young voters and across all races. I mean, he tied Biden in South Carolina among blacks under 30, right? But he got slaughtered by those that were 65 over, and they're a bigger part of the population. They actually turn out and vote where young people haven't been turning out this time around. So it's more of a generational divide that Bernie's been running on, and we heard Democrats say, look, the party's more centrist and it is older. And when those voters actually came into play, I mean, they've moved significantly for Joe Biden. And look, I think that the optimism on the part of Bernie's campaign, the only question now is when does he get out, right? And how quickly does he try and rally behind the establishment? And he can stay in, but quite frankly, He started at 96 delegates down before the night started. He's going to finish way behind that. And the next 4 states coming online next week are even worse for him.
Right.
He's down 40 points plus in Florida. So it's only going to get worse for him. And I think the race is effectively over at this point.
Brad, is there any way that Sanders can spin tonight? What does he need to say to try to keep his voters enthusiastic?
It's hard to spin. And true to Bernie, he gets out of Dodge when he's losing. And the coronavirus became a very good excuse for him to do that and head off to Vermont. If he was winning tonight, he probably would have had a rally, because you get all this earned media, and then you use that as momentum to go on to the next place. You know, the problem with Bernie is he's not going away quietly. He's an ideologue. He's fighting for a mission. And if he can't win the nomination, then he's going to saddle the nominee with a platform. And my prediction is the Democratic convention is going to be hell to pay for their platform. Every plank of the platform will be fought by the Bernie bros in order to put their stamp on the nominee. And it's not going to be a pretty sight.
Well, I want to hold it right here. I'm going to bring Tomi Lahren in, then we're going to get back to this, because I want to touch upon a couple things that were just talked about here in a little bit. We've got Fox Nation host Tomi Lahren. Hi, Tomi. So, Tomi, we've seen, Democrats have very much coalesced around Joe Biden and, essentially making him the Democratic nominee. I mean, there's still some contest to fight, but it's really a hard uphill battle for Bernie Sanders at this point. So why Joe Biden?
Why Joe Biden? Because he's not the socialist, he's not the radical. But I think that what frustrates me is when people call Joe Biden the moderate and they say that Bernie is the anti-establishment candidate. How long has Bernie Sanders been in politics? The fact that we're calling him the anti-establishment is actually very laughable to me. He's never really had a real job in the private sector or done anything beyond being in politics. So the fact that he still tries to play himself as the outsider is quite ridiculous to me. But what you're seeing from Joe Biden is not Joe-mentum. It's not a comeback. It's what happens when the elites, I won't call them establishment because in my mind they're all establishment, when you see the elites coalesce around someone like Joe Biden because they know that Bernie Sanders is too extreme, too radical, and too transparent about his socialist policies. Now, mind you, I'm not saying that the Democratic Party doesn't like those socialist policies. They just prefer a candidate more like a Barack Obama who sneaks those socialist policies in under the radar, not somebody who's saying, I'm going to deliver you a platter of socialist policies. So we've got the elites that are going and really putting all their support behind Joe Biden. You're going to see him be the nominee, and you're going to see no excitement. I mean, if Hillary Clinton wasn't able to create excitement, how the heck is Joe Biden going to create enough excitement to defeat Donald Trump? Not going to happen.
But I mean, it looks like the Democratic Party, I mean, they're seriously coalescing around him after South Carolina. He's been able to win different regions, different parts of the country, and demonstrate some strength there. So what does that mean for 2020 for the general election, do you think?
I mean, if that's what we want to call strength, I mean, the polls are saying that there are some voters who are just as enthusiastic for Joe Biden as they are Bernie Sanders. That might be the saddest thing I've heard all day. Listen, as we continue on and Joe Biden keeps slipping, I mean, he just referred to an AR-15 as an AR-14. He yells at voters when they challenge him. When we see more coming out about Hunter Biden, we see more coming out about the Ukraine connections, the Chinese connections, I think he's going to really unravel when he's asked tough questions. So, yes, they're putting all their money on Joe Biden because they really don't have any other options. But I think you're going to start seeing even more so the unraveling of Joe Biden, which is great for Donald Trump, great for Trump supporters. But it's really sad to see the Democratic Party fall this way when you've got the socialists and the geriatric, and those are your choices. Good luck.
Well, and Tomi, I think we've got the clip that you had just mentioned of that exchange between Joe Biden and the voter talking about, as you said, he said AR-14. Let's play that, and then I want to get your thoughts on that on the back end.
Support the Second Amendment, just like right now, being on fire, that's not free speech. From the very beginning, I have a shotgun, I have a 20 gauge, 12 gauge, my son's hunt. Guess what? I'm not allowed to own anyway. I'm not taking the gun away at all. We just clarified it. Wait. Take the AR-14s away. Don't tell me that they're not going to be serious. A lot of guys want it. I'm not worried. Give me a break, man.
So, Tommy, I've seen a lot of Democrats say, hey, look, that makes Joe Biden look strong. He's standing up to the voter. He's, telling him like it is. What do you think? Does that project strength to you?
He's standing up to the voter. He's standing up to an auto worker who could quite possibly be a potential voter of a Joe Biden. And he's getting very agitated about being even asked a question, which is a very real question. When you just saw Joe Biden come out and say that Beto O'Rourke is going to be, his real czar for gun agenda, it's an honest question to be asked. And you saw him unravel. You see him telling voters to shush. You see him telling voters that they're full of SHIT, and it just goes on and on and on. But again, you're also going to see a lot of people in middle America who might have otherwise maybe thought about voting for Joe Biden. When you hear him talk about the Second Amendment that way, when you hear him not understand the difference between an AR-14 and an AR-15, I think those voters are going to start to realize that either he's misremembering a whole lot, or he's really a dangerous candidate and not the moderate that they might have been looking for.
All right, Tommy, thanks so much. We'll get more from you later, so everyone at home, stay tuned for that. Thank you. So let's, we saw that exchange I played for Tommy as we get more in Michigan right now, 53% in, Biden up 53.1 to Sanders 41, which is really disappointing for Sanders because he had pulled off, that surprise win in 2016, Tom. So a lot of people thought, maybe he would do it again tonight, but he most certainly didn't.
He didn't. And if you go back and look at that race in 2016, Hillary Clinton had a big lead and was sort of coming down, and Sanders was on the rise. And this was a manifestation that he was sort of gaining momentum. Completely different picture today, where Biden is, up now, I think, 18 points in our Real Clear Politics average at the national level. He's really taking off. And so there just wasn't that same sort of magic on the ground for him tonight.
Well, Lincoln, we saw that video I played for Tommy with that exchange for Joe Biden. He's had a lot of these incidents with voters. How do you think that plays out in a general election?
Well, I think what we heard, the analysis there was a theory or perhaps a rant in search of data, right? What we know,
why do you say that?
Because the majority of Americans want the AR-15s taken away. And the majority of Americans do not care if you call an AR-15 or an AR-14.
But in rural areas or the Rust Belt and places that Democrats are going to want to win and put back in the win column for 2020?
Democrats are going to want to win everywhere, right? If we talk about data,
you need Wisconsin, you need Michigan. Hold on just one second, Brad. Well, you need Wisconsin, you need Michigan. You don't think that's an issue there?
However, the votes they're going to pick up in those states may not, a person who is a gun, I'm voting on guns as my first and only issue, is not voting for Joe Biden. And any Democratic strategist who thinks they are is wrong. And any Republican strategist who thinks the Democrats need those votes is also wrong. There are plenty of other votes in those states. This guy, and I respect his opinion, he's allowed to have his views on the Second Amendment and on gun rights. And I think he made some good points in that dispute. But he's not coming in there as somebody who might vote, right? The working class white voter who does want his guns for hunting and things like that, but is concerned about the calibers of the weapons, right? The suburban woman, the African-American person who stayed home for whatever reason in 2016. That's what the Democrats need to worry about in states like Michigan and Wisconsin. And to say otherwise, look, it is clear. Let's be clear here. Joe Biden's been running for president on and off since 1988, right? I was in college at that time, and I'm not a young dude, right? So
you're younger than Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders.
So is everyone
you have
else
that going for him.
So is everyone else in America. But
they make us all feel young.
He's been doing this for 40-odd years, and he's not good at it, or 30-odd years, and he's not good at it. And to defend Joe Biden on the grounds that he's a natural politician, a great candidate, is frankly absurd. Right?
Brad, he's going to be the Democratic guy.
That's right. And if he were running against somebody who could put together full sentences, he would be in trouble.
But here's the problem. The primary system defines who you're going to select as a candidate of the convention. You select before you elect. Right? The party selects, the people elect. They're going to select somebody who is totally unelectable. That's what's going to happen. And then they're going to try and frame Joe up with a younger, perhaps a minority VP, and trying to put a bow on Joe Biden. But people don't vote for vice presidents. They vote for president. They're stuck with a guy. And when you take votes for granted and say, oh, we're never going to get that vote, those votes don't mean anything, independents and swing voters are the key.
Right.
Why alienate people?
I want to get, now we've got Tezalyn Figaro here as well. And Lincoln, hold that thought too, because we're going to get back to you. So we still got a lot more time tonight. So everyone stay tuned for that. Tezalyn is a former Sanders campaign national staffer. Tezalyn, before we get to Sanders' undoing, I want to ask you, so you supported him in 2016. Why did you support him? What was it about Bernie Sanders that drew you to his candidacy?
Hi, Lisa. It's good to see you again. I've mentioned many times, I think you and I have been on the set many times, I've always said that I was not a socialist, that I was an independent voter, and I thought it was necessary to have someone in to push the system, to push the establishment. At that time, they wouldn't allow anyone else to run. They had already identified Hillary Clinton as the nominee. They certainly had locked it up early to not even give people an opportunity to hear Bernie Sanders' message. So the political climate then in 2016 is actually very different now. I actually supported Hillary Clinton over Barack Obama when she ran against him. So people get caught up in what people did in 2016, and they think that carries on to the next cycle. And that's what Bernie Sanders is learning tonight with seeing this Michigan result with over 53% going for Joe Biden. He has lost every area that he did well in with 2016. He has not been able to expand his base, and that is because what was good then is not necessarily good now for most Democrat voters.
But Tezalyn, you'd mentioned sort of the dynamics with the establishment. But aren't we seeing that play out now? Because we've seen, the Democratic establishment is essentially, they've coalesced around Joe Biden. He's gotten all the endorsements of the establishment. So aren't we kind of seeing that play out again, where once again the establishment is sort of deciding the race and, pushing Bernie Sanders to the side?
Well, the establishment coalesced around Hillary Clinton in Michigan, and we still won Michigan. I was in Michigan for about 3 or 4 months for Bernie Sanders. The reality is this: there is establishment politics that plays on both sides. We know that there is a such thing as an establishment politics. But Bernie Sanders has to take this L and take this responsibility. For those who don't know what L means, that means he has to take this loss. At the end of the day, Bernie Sanders had more volunteers, he had more donors, he had more ground game. Our revolution organized all over this country. He's been running for the last 5 years, Lisa. So at some point, people just have to realize that people do not want a socialist running against Donald Trump. It doesn't mean that Joe Biden is the best candidate. I think he's a terrible candidate. I think that Donald Trump is going to have a field day with Joe Biden. So my analysis for general election is very different than the primary. But right now, Democrats want this to be over. They're tired of this exhausting primary. And to be honest with you, Bernie Sanders' movement just has not inspired. It has been more chaotic, more toxic, and it just hasn't been a movement that people want to follow. We see that with the youth vote being lower than what it was in 2016. Biden has won white voters, educated and non-educated, black voters, educated and non-educated. I mean, he's just cleaning up across the board. And it's not just because he was Barack Obama's vice president. It's not because he's the best candidate. It's not because he doesn't have 500 gaffes a month. It is simply because Democrats know that a Democrat socialist will not galvanize moderate and independent voters.
So, Tezalyn, you had mentioned that your analysis for the Democratic primary is different than the general election. What's your analysis for the general election?
The general election is no matter who runs against President Trump, he runs a totally different style of campaigning. It was one that worked really well for Republicans. They be able to hit back hard and harder than those that come at him. That's actually what Bernie Sanders tried to do, and it failed. That's not what works. It doesn't work well, on the Democrat side. So he still has to deal with Trump's economy. You have to deal with a party that is locked and loaded, that are falling in line, directly behind President Trump. So it's a totally different general election. And so we'll see. I tell people all the time not to be surprised if Donald Trump is reelected. There's also folks who say they refuse to come out and vote because their agenda is not being met. The Bernie Bros, for example, it is a real Bernie or bust coalition that's out there that will not vote. Do you think they support Trump again?
We saw in 2016, we saw 1 in 10 Bernie Sanders supporters actually went for Donald Trump. Do you think that happens again for 2020?
Some out of spite. In 2016, it was more or less because he was more in line with trade, and some of it was out of spite. But I just, to be honest with you, a lot of it is just out of spite, period. They'll either vote for Trump just to prove a point, or they'll stay at home. And it's not just the Bernie Bros. The African-American community as well. I keep constantly saying this because you don't hear this a lot on mainstream media, but there is also a sector of African-American voters, although a lot of them have voted for Vice President Biden. There is still a sector out there that says they could care less if you get get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more Trumps. Until a black agenda is put on the table with the Democrat Party, they won't be voting as well. So General's going to tell a whole different story than what we see now. But as of now, this is apparently who the Democrat Party wants to move forward with.
Tezalyn, there's a lot of hope from Republicans in the general election, particularly President Trump, as you mentioned, that he could get some of that African-American support. Going against potentially Joe Biden, which it looks like it might be, do you think he can do that?
Sure, he can. Anything is possible. You know, I'm not one. Whoever is presenting the best policies for the African American community, unlike my liberal colleagues, I don't have a problem with it. As you know, I supported First Step Act. I support unemployment being down in the African American community. I owned a staffing firm, you know, for 15 years. So I obviously believe in folks getting a job. I believe in entrepreneurship. I'm a small business owner. I believe in school choice. So those are real issues. We remember Florida in the midterms. They voted. A lot of black women voted for school choice and went with Republicans at that time. So President Trump doesn't have to get 40% of the black community or 20% or 10%. He only needs to pull just a little bit of the vote enough to swing it his way, in addition to the base that he's already been able to maintain. President Trump has been able to maintain his base. Bernie Sanders, not only did he not maintain, he lost a lot of his base, and that's the difference.
And Tezalyn, real quick before we've got to go, how much longer does Bernie Sanders stay in this race?
It just depends if he's going to be go out of spite and burn the whole house down, literally, figuratively, Bernie, and wait until June, or if he'll go ahead and step aside and realize it's over. I guess the question is, how many more donations is he looking to pull between now and June?
Interesting. Tezalyn, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Have a good one.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
You too.
So there was a lot of reaction from the comment with my question to Tezalyn about President Trump looking to get an increased share of the African-American vote for 2020. Brad, is that a possibility for him?
Absolutely. And the reason being is President Trump has a record of accomplishment. Remember when he said, "What do you have to lose?" And everybody was in shock. How could he say that? Well, it's true. What did he have? What do they have to lose by looking at Trump? And now, what do you have to lose by looking at his record? You won. You won more under President Trump than probably any Republican president in modern history, because he didn't take you for granted. He was fighting for every American, and it's shown in job performance and salary. So Donald Trump can go to these communities and say, you're much better off today than you were 4 years ago. A question every voter considers when they go into the voting booth.
Lincoln, I mean, what about that? I mean, you look at things like criminal justice reform. You look at lower unemployment for African Americans.
White supremacy. You look at saying that the people.
Come on.
Wait a second. That's
unfair.
That's not unfair.
Yes,
That's not unfair. You know what? Outside of this little studio, that's absolutely understood almost universally in American society.
No, it's not. That's unfair.
And I know that in Republican talking points, it's not. But
no, actually, no. Hold on one second. I have to correct you because
no, you do.
Yeah, I do have to.
Actually, opinion. You're not correcting me.
No, I am.
You're not correcting me.
Well,
when he says absurd things, or your guests say absurd things, don't say I'm correcting them.
Lincoln,
are you positive?
Lincoln, I'm hosting the show, so I'd appreciate a little bit of respect
sure.
right
and I'm
now.
a guest, and I'd appreciate a little.
Well, I think I have been. I've gone to.
You said you were correcting me
because I disagree with something.
So say I disagree.
And I also, Joe Biden launched his candidacy off of a lie, which was Charlottesville. And if you actually go back and if you actually take 2 minutes to read the transcript of Charlottesville, if anyone actually is astute enough to take 2 to 5 minutes to actually read through it, President Trump made it very, very clear that he was condemning the KKK and the neo-Nazis, and not at any point during the transcript does he support them. So Joe Biden launched his candidacy off a lie, and it seems like you're carrying that same tune.
We know he said that, but the broader point is this.
Have you read the transcript?
Yes, of course I read the transcript.
That's not what he says. You fundamentally cannot believe that.
The broader point is this. Republican candidates, you know, I've heard this for every incumbent Republican candidate. They'll do better. And sometimes they do. The ballpark we're talking about here, Trump got about 8%, right? As your guest said, she said 10, but maybe he'll get 10. He's not getting 20. So you're talking, can he get to 10? Can he get to 12? You know, maybe. We don't know. There are a lot of data that shows that African American voters in many ways are more conservative than kind of liberal Democratic elites would like to think. And the stumbling point, frankly, is the racism. And I don't know how to say that nicely, but that is the issue. So, for example, Donald Trump's complete silence on issues of police violence. That sends a message to African American voters.
Well, he's worked on criminal justice reform. But the comments from Joe Biden, okay, let me just ask you this. So Joe Biden has said that poor kids can be just as bright as white kids.
Right, you should play records to them.
You can't go into 7-Eleven unless you have an Indian accent. Do comments like that from Joe Biden offend you? Are those racist statements?
Yes, I think so.
Does he have any ground to stand on here as
It is an unfortunate, and I want to stay, I will correct myself. I don't like to say Donald Trump is a racist or Joe Biden is a racist. I like to say that racism is a problem that with which we all as a society have to wrestle. And Joe Biden certainly says things that are that are problematic for me, just like Donald Trump does. I think what Biden can do, and what Biden is a big part of his success here, is having Barack Obama's back for 8 years, which cannot be taken for granted for a white politician in America. Is the Democratic Party's record of being out front on civil rights issues for the last, for most of, we can go back and discuss the history of the 60s when it was more of a bipartisan issue, but in the more modern era. That is what caps the Republican vote, the African American vote for Republican candidates. So can it get to 10%? I would say yes. Can it get much beyond that? I would say no. Now, can 8 and 10% make a difference in some states? Of course. But to say it's going to get to 20 is not a serious assertion.
And also, President Trump has repeatedly denounced white supremacy and the KKK. I just feel like that's a fundamentally unfair statement to make. And with all due respect,
when you bring people like Steve Bannon and Steve Miller into the White House, you can't say those things.
I wouldn't make the same comment about a Democrat either. You're speaking from a place you do not have knowledge of. So I think it's just a fundamentally unfair statement, which is why I reacted to you to that degree. But Tom, I want to get what Lincoln had said. It is, but so. Tom, I also want to talk about, Lincoln had mentioned that even if you get, 10% share of the African-American vote, we've seen in races where even just that slight increase of share matters. I mean, you look at the Florida gubernatorial race, you look at Ron DeSantis, part of his victory against Gillum was because of African-American support, African-American women, particularly on issues like school choice. So, I mean, are there areas that you see or particular states where President Trump could increase those shares where it might be a difference maker?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, it's Wisconsin, it's Milwaukee, it's Detroit and Michigan, it's Philly for Pennsylvania. I mean, those are basically it. The places where Donald Trump, and he's been aggressively, his campaign has been pretty aggressively targeting African-American voters and trying to, I mean, every chance he gets, he mentions, African-American unemployment, Latino unemployment being at 50-year all-time lows, whatever. So they are making a play for that. And Lincoln's right. I mean, he got 8% in 2016, which was, I think, as good or better than Mitt Romney had done before. If he can get to 10%, if he can get into double digits, it absolutely could be a game changer for him in those especially in those states.
Well, and as you guys can see there, we're going to see the Vice President Joe Biden is set to speak here soon. He's going to talk in Pennsylvania. So once we have that, we will take that. Brad, what do you think we're going to hear from Joe Biden tonight? Clearly, it's a great night for him. He's coming off the heels of an awesome Super Tuesday and just clear sailing ever since South Carolina primary. What does he say tonight?
I think he says that he's back and that this is now, he probably won't say this, but it's clearly his to win at this point. And he has done things that nobody else has been able to do as far as a Democratic presumptive nominee. He's done very well tonight, better than anybody could have expected. But I want to get back to one other point, one other constituency for Trump, and that's the Jewish population, who tends to vote in a knee-jerk reaction as a Democrat, as a Jewish Republican. I've talked to Democrats who used to whisper about Trump's support for Israel, are now quite appreciative of the support that President Trump has given to Israel and the things he's done. So not only do I think he's going to make inroads in the African-American community, but I also think Jewish Americans have come around, Democrats, to Donald Trump solely because of what he has done. He's put his money where his mouth is. And when other presidents like Barack Obama promised to move the embassy to Jerusalem,
or Ronald Reagan,
yeah. They never did it, but it was the law of the land that they do it. And the fact of the matter is, in 1992, it became the law. So Ronald Reagan spoke. Ronald Reagan spoke from rhetoric, but other presidents did not enforce the law as written. And Donald Trump, all he did was enforce American law that was written and passed and signed by the president. And he finally did it. And he's done other things that presidents talk about but never did. So he's got a record of accomplishment.
As a Jewish Democrat, I recognize it's a complicated issue, and I want to speak respectfully here. But I also want to caution viewers to think that Jews are single-issue voters or have any kind of dual loyalties. We, as a group, care about Israel. There's no denying that. It is not the only issue on which we vote, and it's certainly not the country to which we are loyal, even when Donald Trump calls it our country. Jewish Americans have voted Democratic, I wouldn't say knee-jerk, but overwhelming numbers.
Knee-jerk.
Consistently, no. There are reasons for that. One of them is the Democratic Party over Republican opposition that fought to recognize the state of Israel. That was Harry Truman over the opposition that was then a Republican Congress, right? Now, that was a long time ago. That was my father's generation, even my grandfather's generation. But Jewish Americans, like other minority groups, have a real stake in feeling safe in a country that recognizes religious diversity and religious plurality. And that is something that I don't want to have a big fight about this, but there have been, I think, charitably one could say, real questions raised about this in this administration. And there are
What about fighting for religious freedom?
Religious freedom for Jews. Okay?
Or religious freedom for
But I'm
all.
saying as a Jewish perspective, because I'm not a Muslim. I can't speak from a Muslim. I'm not a fundamentalist Christian. I can't speak from that perspective. But for many people, religious freedom means the ability, not who do I have to bake a wedding cake for, right? Which frankly, I kind of can see both sides of that issue, for sure. It is, do I feel comfortable that as someone who is not Jewish, or is Jewish, or is not Christian in a majority Christian country, my rights are fully respected. My credentials as an American are fully respected.
Right.
And that is an issue which has largely broken. I mean, unless you are suggesting that Jews aren't smart enough to make decisions on their own, which frankly, I'm not comfortable saying.
And Tom, real quick, I want to get your thoughts before going to Peter Ducey real quick. I mean, is there any hope for Bernie Sanders as we wait to hear from Joe Biden? No, I mean that with all sincerity. I mean, you cover this. You're looking at all the dynamics. You're looking at the states ahead. Is there any path forward for Bernie Sanders at this point after tonight?
He's going to exit tonight down, triple digits in delegates, and he needs a game changer. I mean, he needs something to happen. Now, could it happen on the debate stage on Sunday? Perhaps, if Biden has a moment where he, has a senior moment or something. I mean, or something else. But beyond that, he's not going to be able to change the dynamic of this race, the trajectory of it. It's going to get worse and worse for him, and he's going to. I mean, it's for all intents and purposes, barring some catastrophic event.
Right.
He's going to fall short.
All right, we've got Fox News. Peter Ducey is standing by live in Cleveland tonight at the site of Joe Biden's now canceled rally. Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm cold, Lisa. Normally we would be inside at 20 till 10 on a primary election night, but we were in there in the Cuyahoga County Community College gym. They were setting up the podium. They were testing the music out, and all of a sudden, a few minutes after Bernie Sanders announced that his event in Cleveland, which is going to have their primary next week, was going to be canceled for public health concerns. Then the Biden people stopped setting up, and they said, you guys have 2 hours, and then that's going to be it for this event. Biden never came to Cleveland today. He was in Columbus, Ohio earlier, but his plane never touched down here. They diverted it to Philadelphia, which is close to his campaign headquarters, and now, kind of like the Bernie Sanders campaign, the Biden people are telling us they are going to be in contact with public health officials before they schedule anything else. And that's going to be a big change for a guy like Joe Biden, who gets up close and personal with more candidates, with more constituents than anybody coming. There's a lot of selfies. There's a lot of hugs and kisses with some of the people who have been following him for years and go to see him. A lot of the older constituents are getting the hugs these days. That, combined with large indoor events, don't bode well for presidential primary candidates. So it'll be interesting to see what the campaign officials are able to work out with public health officials in terms of getting Biden and Bernie Sanders, for that matter, back out here.
Well,
Lisa?
And Peter, that makes your job interesting. So what does your next, few days look like on the campaign trail if there really isn't a campaign trail?
I don't know, because Biden was never going to have anything tomorrow. He was going to go to Tampa on Thursday for an event that has now been canceled for this same reason, public health. They're now telling us he's going to give remarks just to the press on Thursday, closer to home in Wilmington, Delaware. And so this changes a lot for the way that the candidates will be covered as well, because we do try to be not only in the room with the candidate, but also all these potential supporters to kind of get a feel for how things are going. But if everybody is isolated, if that is indeed what the campaigns are starting to count on, or if what the campaigns are encouraging by telling people just to go home, it is going to be a little bit complicated.
Yeah, I guess instead of handshakes and kissing babies, it'll be like an elbow and I don't know what else. An air high five.
They'll be, normally people. Right, so the candidates will just be squirting Purell for anybody that comes close.
It'll be at the front before anyone enters. Peter, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you. And now we've got Fox Nation host Tomi Lahren to respond to the latest in the results tonight. Hi, Tomi. So we're awaiting Joe Biden, who is set to speak in Pennsylvania. What do you think we'll hear from him?
Oh, I think he's going to be fairly excited. And I just wanted to go off of some of the coronavirus talk because that seems to be the hot topic lately. So I'd like to kind of chime in on that. We also know that Joe Biden is very used to getting very up close and personal with several potential voters. So I think we can all rest easy that he's not going to be having a ton more events. But this also could be a real silver lining for Joe Biden, because the more he speaks, the more he unravels. So if he doesn't have to be at a lot of these public events on stage for viral moments to happen, that might be the best thing that could happen for his candidacy and just his personal well-being. But speaking of the race tonight, I think that it's undeniable that Joe Biden's going to do well both this week, next week. I think the real question is, as you guys have been talking about, is Bernie going to stay in out of spite? Is he going to stay in so he can get some good content for the next book he's going to write to further add to his millions? Or is he going to bow out like he did with Hillary, even though Biden is certainly less intimidating than a Hillary Clinton? I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Do you think he gets out?
I don't. I think that he's going to take this revolution. Obviously, he's getting up there in age. So if he wants to continue the steam from this revolution and get people real riled up, then I think he stays in. And also, even if he drops out, I think one of the other things we need to take into account is he started kind of a radical revolution, not just in this country with his Bernie revolution and his Bernie bros, but with the squad, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley. They really did come off of the coattails of someone like a Bernie Sanders. So he needs to maintain that revolution. He needs to maintain that energy for their sake, because that's really kind of what they're betting on as well. And that's how they've been able to get so much control, especially from Nancy Pelosi, is by this kind of a revolution and this energy. So Joe Biden has to, or Bernie Sanders has to continue to stoke that, or else they're going to be hurting.
So what do you think that revolution means for the general election then? I mean, you're aware we saw in 2016 where 1 in 10 Sanders supporters actually ended up voting for Donald Trump. Does that happen again? Do you think the president will make that appeal to Bernie Sanders supporters? They got robbed again and try to lure them over?
I think Tezalyn was right when she said that instead of voting for Donald Trump, they're just going to stay home. I don't think they're going to vote for anybody. I think that they're going to feel very disenfranchised and they're just going to stay home. They're going to be very active on social media. And that's another point I wanted to make as well. You're seeing with kind of how Bernie Sanders is not doing as well anymore, even though he was doing very well early on in the process. Now he's not doing as well. It really is the difference between social media activism and retweets and people that are proud to say they're Bernie Sanders supporters and people who actually go out and vote. Social media is not reality in a lot of these cases, and you're starting to see that now with how well Joe Biden has been able to do.
How excited do you think Democrats will be to support Joe Biden in a general election?
I think it's going to be really difficult for them to fake that. I think they're going to act like they're really excited about it. I think that they're going to really I don't know if they turn out or not. It would be fueled by a Trump hatred, but it's really hard to hate a president that's doing very well for the majority of Americans. But beyond that, I think what you're going to see is more pressure on Barack Obama to kind of come to Biden's defense and his aid and to really show people that they can be comfortable with a Joe Biden. I'm not sure Obama's going to do that, but I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for him to do so.
All right, Tomi, thanks so much for joining us, and you are going to be sticking around, so there's much more from you here in a little bit. Thank you.
See you in a little bit.
Thanks, Tommy. And we've got Fox News' Shannon Bream as well. Oh, just kidding. All right, well, we will at some point, I think. So sorry, it's a little bit of a tease, so something to look forward to. So, Brad, what do you make of what you just heard from Tommy, looking ahead a little bit at the general election?
Yeah, I think that Joe Biden, certainly in the races that he's tried before, has failed, and he's failed miserably. Never won a primary, but until this year, and then really caught fire, but only after faltering. So, look, he's going to win the nomination if he does fair and square. Bernie's not going to have the same argument as he had in 2016 that he got screwed. He didn't. As a matter of fact, he changed some of the rules by which has affected these races. So the question is, how does he go home? Does he go home a team player? Does he work at the convention to build a platform that is going to be saleable to the rank and file Democrats? Or is he going to saddle Biden with a platform that is totally dead on arrival with swing voters and independents? I happen to think that's where they're going. They didn't come this far to just go away, and they're going to try and have as much influence as possible on the nominee.
Well, and Lincoln, you had mentioned earlier in the show that, you know, Joe Biden's a flawed candidate. What are some of those flaws that concern you for a 2020 matchup, general election?
I just wanted to say one of the things your guest said about him wanting to stay, you know, that the coronavirus might help him because he has to do fewer public events. I think that's true, and that could be, I think both candidates aren't heartbroken about that development. One thing that strikes me, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, is that now he's no longer just a guy who's running for president. He's the likely, almost certain Democratic nominee, the kind of consensus front runner. And at this point in the race, I still don't know what Joe Biden stands for.
Interesting.
Now, I know where I disagree with some of the other analysts is that what we've seen since January 2017 is that Donald Trump is a massive mobilizer for the Democratic Party. They could nominate this coffee cup and the vote would come out against Donald Trump. So that's...
It's too late to get in. So
yeah, it's too late to get in.
Can't get on the ballot in this
Although things go, we don't know exactly. So I think that's a major flaw with Biden. He is not gifted verbally, and part of it is because of his lifelong stutter, but there's other issues as well. He has a certain... I had an older Jewish voter, actually, in California who voted absentee for Biden.
Sorry, we've got Shannon Bream, and we only have her for a short period of time, so I want to get her in, and then Lincoln will get some more thoughts from you. And Tom, I want to get your thoughts about some of this voter analysis. So we've got Shannon Bream, host of Fox News at Night, here exclusively for some Fox News voter analysis. Hi, Shannon.
Hey, Lisa, you know what? We want to talk about how Joe Biden pulled off this Michigan, Missouri, Mississippi trifecta tonight. It's a good night for him again, with the same key groups that have been coming through for him since South Carolina. Look at the breakdown here. Moderate voters today, around 7 in 10 in all three of these states, very important, win for Biden. He also carried black voters, seniors, and churchgoers. They have been strong for him all through the primary season. Now, the white working class vote has backed both Sanders and Biden in different contests this so far, but tonight, they went for Joe. Health care was the top issue for Democrats voting today. And those voters who said, listen, I'm worried about who can handle health care, they felt it was Biden. They went big for him also. Voters who were looking to return to Washington the way that it was before President Trump versus an overhaul of government as we know it, well, they went for the winner tonight. In Michigan and Missouri, Sanders won with those voters that wanted to completely change the political system. Not surprising. Now, late deciders once again are coming through for the former vice president. This is what we saw in South Carolina. We also saw this on Super Tuesday. Check this out. 2/3 of the voters across the three states backed Biden. Finally, electability outweighs just about everything else this year for Democrats. So who do they think can beat Donald Trump? In Michigan, more than 8 in 10 said they think Biden can beat Trump. About 6 in 10 say the same thing about Sanders. So Biden has made that electability argument, and it came through for him tonight. 3 more states in his win column tonight. Lisa, for now, back to you.
Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate it.
You got it.
Just one last thought on that.
Sure.
When the Democratic Party, the fundamental problem with Biden is he's the insider resume candidate. And that is not who the Democratic, I said this before, it's not what the Democratic Party wins with. They wins with somebody, and I agree that Sanders is about as much of an outsider as I'm a Major League Baseball player, but they win with people who can somehow persuade the voters that they are outsiders. If we look at some of the negatives that will drag Biden in this race, I think a lot of it is because he's been in Washington forever. Whether he's been a good senator, a bad senator, good VP, bad VP, that's what follows him. And that's not what the Democrats need. They need someone with a little bit of a fresh face. Biden isn't that. So that together makes him, in my view, a flawed candidate. Not that he can't win, but not the ideal candidate.
Well, and Tom, we just heard from Shannon breaking down some of the voter analysis. Is there anything that stood out to you about what she said?
No, it all seems pretty much according to script. I think Biden was winning moderates. He was winning late deciders. I mean, this is following what we saw on Super Tuesday. I'll go back and make a couple quick points. I talked about trying to change this race, Bernie Sanders trying to change this race, and you saw from Peter Doocy's report, the coronavirus has really frozen this race. Right. It's going to be really hard, extra hard, if they're not holding rallies, if they're not doing these events.
Yeah, but that's self-imposed.
It's self-imposed, yes, no. but it's now dominating the news,
yes,
even more so than the political coverage. The other thing, Joe Biden is offering a return to, as I think Shannon pointed out, right, a return to life before Trump, right, when things were better. And the one thing that I would not underestimate about him, and we didn't talk enough about in 2016, is a lot of people voted for Donald Trump because they simply could not pull the trigger for Hillary Clinton. They just could not stand her. Joe Biden is much more likable, certainly among Democratic voters, but even among independents. He's a fresh, I shouldn't say fresh face, but he's a recognizable, and in that sense, he may be able to lure some of those folks back who are they're Trump supporters. Maybe they're squishy, but they really don't like the president's style. They may like the economy and all that, but they're tired of the chaos and all that. And if that's the case, then I think it could be a really close race.
How does Hillary Clinton's constituency of Democratic primary voters in 2016 match or differ from Joe Biden's for 2020?
I think the biggest piece for me, I think Lincoln mentioned that Biden's winning men. He's doing better with men, but also Latinos. She had Latinos in her corner in 2016, and I don't think that Bernie's been doing pretty well with Latinos. I mean, I think now that the race is sort of broken free, Biden's doing better with Latinos now. But I don't think he had the same level of support. I think that was more of a core of Clinton's coalition.
And Brad, real quick, so regarding the Rust Belt, so Tom saying that Biden might appeal to some voters that were turned off by Hillary Clinton. One key place for 2020 are those Rust Belt states: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. Does Joe Biden put those states in play for Democrats, or what do you think?
No, I think because policy trumps personality. When you're talking to Rust Belt and you're talking about putting wholesale unions out of work, no fracking, no oil, no gas, and then basically tells them to suck it up. You have to find other jobs, be retooled. Come on, man. No, that's not what they want to hear. But when Donald Trump visited them, sometimes in Democratic areas, and said, you know what? You're going to have a job. We're going to put these people back to work. And he's done his best and has honored his promise in creating jobs in the energy sector. For the first time, we're energy independent. We're exporting energy. So I don't think Biden's message, which is going to be pushed by the socialist agenda of Bernie and others within the Democratic Party to push Biden as far left as they can get him, that's not going to play well.
Well, but about fracking, though, Lincoln, because that is an interesting point you mentioned. So Joe Biden said, let's get rid of fossil fuels. So how does that play out when you're talking about getting rid of industries in a lot of these key states, particularly the Rust Belt? You're talking about eliminating jobs. You're talking about essentially, potentially sending jobs overseas. So how does that play out? How does getting rid of fossil fuels, fracking, and a lot of these individuals' jobs play out in those states?
I mean, the Rust Belt states are similar. They're not all the same. So, for example,
but how does the issue of fracking play out?
So, for example, I would take Ohio off the table. Ohio's false gold for the Democrats. I don't think they're going to win Ohio. I don't think I just don't see that happening. The other states, there's no question that this hurts them. There's also there's a central paradox of the Trump presidency. If you take away the tweets and all of that stuff, which is the following. His economy, the economy we have today, and we don't know what's going to happen with the coronavirus. So let's back up. The economy 2 weeks ago, before all this happened, is one where an incumbent should get reelected easily, right? Because it is a strong economy. However, the data has always shown that he's struggling. When you ask, are those states in play? Now, I don't work for the Trump campaign, but if you ask them, of course they're in play. That's where they're putting all their efforts, and they're losing by narrow margin or essentially neck and neck in all those states. There's something about Donald Trump that people do not like, regardless of what's happening with the economy. I think that's very hard to argue that point is wrong. Now, what Trump has to do is to say...
argue that Trump is wrong. I can argue that point is wrong because polling has never, with regard to Donald Trump, been accurate.
Polling, no. Actually, go back and look at the statewide polling. This is fascinating. At the end of 2016, it was very accurate. You know who was wrong? the analysts, the Nate Silvers, the people like me who looked at the polling and didn't quite believe it. But Michigan was neck and neck in the last polls. Ohio, Pennsylvania, they were all neck and neck. It was the analysts who got it wrong, not the actual data itself.
Well, I know someone on this panel who covers that very closely.
I was looking at your site every day.
Yeah. So, Tom, what about that? How big of a misreading do we see in 2016 of the polls? And is that happening again with even the conversations that we're having tonight for 2020?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and I get asked this, I go around and give speeches all around the country. It's the first question that comes up. Can we trust the polls, right? And how bad were the polls wrong in 2016? And Lincoln's right. I mean, if you go back and look at our final electoral map the day before the election, the last poll we put in Pennsylvania and our average had Trump up a point. The last one we put in Michigan had Trump up a point. Pennsylvania was under 2 percentage points. We had Trump winning Florida, North Carolina, Nevada, which he didn't win. We didn't have him winning Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania. But even then, it was a 272, 268 type situation. I mean, it was a close race. But that was not the impression that a lot of folks got from the punditry. I mean, you had David Plouffe and very well-respected individuals on TV saying it was 100% in the bag, 99.9% in the bag. Sam Wang from Princeton University went on and ate a bug on national television afterwards as penance, right? So you did have this disconnect between...
But is that happening again?
I think that, look, I think there is evidence to suggest that Trump, there are some shy Trumpers out there. There's shy Trump effect. There was in 2016 when you looked at live dial polls versus robo polls. Trump's numbers were higher when they didn't have to speak to an actual individual and they just pushed buttons. There might be some of that still, although you can see, the way that the Republican Party is behind Trump now. I mean, people are much less afraid, at least Trump supporters, of saying, "Hey, I'm behind this guy." So it's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to wait and find out. The one thing that the pollsters, I think, missed before was the education gap.
Right. Hi, I'm Lisa Boothe, your host at Fox Nation tonight. We are covering a variety of states. Some of them have already been called for Joe Biden. Everyone at home has been covering the Democratic primary. We saw Bernie Sanders really got off to a great start in some of the early primary states. He won in New Hampshire. He had a great showing in Nevada, did exceptionally well, even with Hispanics and minority voters there. However, the dynamics really changed. For South Carolina, Joe Biden had a huge victory, even larger than most projected, and he's really carried that with the wind at his back. He had a huge night on Super Tuesday, an absolute domination there, winning states like Texas, which were critically important. Bernie Sanders did not do as well in California, which was really, his opportunity to try to run up the score if he was going to. And that takes us tonight. And what we have already is races have been called in Missouri, as folks at home can see. Michigan, we've got 58% reporting, Joe Biden with 53.2%, as you see there. And also the state of Mississippi has been called for Joe Biden, 80.6%. Sanders did get above that 15% threshold, which wasn't questioned a little bit earlier today. And for those at home who are wondering why I mentioned the 15% threshold, the way that the Democratic primaries work is they allocate their votes proportionally. So if you get above the 15% threshold, you get some variety of state or delegates statewide, and then also in most of the contest, congressional districts as well, although some states like Texas are different where they do those state Senate seats as well. So that's why I mentioned the 15%. So again, another really, really big night for Joe Biden. The wind is at his back. And the question is, what's next for Bernie Sanders? You look ahead at some additional contests next week, particularly Tuesday, states like Florida, another big delegate state where Joe Biden is really projected to do really, really well. So the question tonight is, what happens to Bernie Sanders? Does he stay in? And we're also waiting on Joe Biden to address folks at home as well. He's in Pennsylvania. So what does he say? Does he call on Bernie Sanders to get out of the race? These are all questions we are addressing tonight here on Fox Nation. I've got a team next to me we've been having some really interesting conversations tonight. So I hope you guys have been with us, and I hope you stay with us as well as we continue out this night and talking about what all this means. We've got Tom Bevan, Real Clear Politics right here. We've got Lincoln and Brad Blakeman as well. And we've been covering a lot of interesting dynamics. And just for a reset for those at home, Tom, take us through what we've seen tonight and why it all matters.
Well, this was shaping up, and it's turned out to be another great night for Joe Biden. And as we mentioned before in the previous hour, sort of followed the same script of Super Tuesday. Biden's winning broad-based votes across all groups. And Bernie was not able to expand his coalition. And in fact, it's shrunk, particularly in Michigan, from where it was in 2016. And so it's a pretty resounding win for Biden. It looks like Joe Momentum is still on. And this, given where the delegate count started at, just shy of 100, and where this race is going to finish after tonight, I think it's the end of the road for Bernie Sanders. And as you mentioned, the question is, well, how long does he decide to try and stick it out? Because I think mathematically now, Joe Biden has got a real death grip on this nomination.
And Lincoln, same question to you. What stands out to you tonight as we're watching these results come in? What stands out to you?
What stands out to me is how quickly this race, 3 weeks ago, this race seemed just, Bloomberg was coming in, Buttigieg, there was momentum, and now it looks like so many of the races from the kind of 80s and 90s where there's the mainstream kind of front-runner candidate and there's the kind of lefty, what we used to call the elite protest candidate, because they're getting a lot of kind of white lefty types, and the mainstream candidates winning 65-35, 70-30, 60-40. It became that way. This could be Dukakis and Jesse Jackson. It's the very same dynamic. Not that this happened, but just how quickly that happened. That really strikes me.
Brad, what stands out to you?
What stands out to me is Elizabeth Warren, and here's why. Joe Biden won. He won handily. If I'm Elizabeth Warren, I still have yet to endorse. The endorsement window is closing. Bernie's not.
And Andrew Yang endorsed Biden tonight as well.
And Bernie's not getting out tonight. So if I'm Elizabeth Warren, I'm saying, what should I do? Well, if she goes to Bernie, it's more the same. She gets nothing by giving her support to Bernie because Bernie's losing, and you're just like Bernie. Wouldn't it be better for her to give her support to Biden? That would really be another death knell to Sanders, but it also gives Warren the ability to be a player for her agenda in a Biden administration and also at the convention. So to me, tomorrow, I want to see what, if anything, Elizabeth Warren does.
Well, and let's carry on that thought. I've got Tezalyn, and we'll get back to the panel as well, so stay by, guys. So we've got Tezalyn Figaro, Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign national staffer. Hey, Tezalyn.
Hey.
So, and the current delegate, sorry, we've got a little bit more update. The current delegate tracker, as you can see there, now has Biden with 154 delegate lead over Bernie Sanders. Tezalyn, one of our panelists had just mentioned, what does Elizabeth Warren do? Who do you think does she endorse? What do you think about that?
Well, remember in 2016, she didn't endorse. She waited until the coast was clear, kind of like Andrew Yang. He just endorsed, I don't know if you guys know, he just endorsed Joe Biden, waited until the coast was clear to come out the bushes. So Elizabeth Warren will probably do the same as she did in 2016, wait until there's a Democrat nominee. But then again, the political climate has changed. She may go ahead and come out now, not necessarily because she wants a BP position, which I'm sure she does, but really just to rally her troops around what she thinks is a more positive campaign. I'll say again that Joe Biden is really a terrible candidate. He has a lot of flaws, but at the end of the day, he brings a certain calmness that she likes. She doesn't like the toxic environment that Bernie Sanders seems to bring with his movement. He has yet to take responsibility for a lot of the things that go on, not just with random supporters, but within his leadership. And so that has been a problem for her. She has constantly been damned if you do, damned if you don't. If she tries to work with Bernie supporters, her supporters get mad. When she goes against Bernie supporters get mad and drag her for days on the internet. So I think she probably might come out for Joe Biden earlier than what she did in 2016. But, you never know.
And Tezalyn, you mentioned VP. So if Joe Biden doesn't end up getting the nomination, which it looks like he's on track for after tonight, who do you think he's looking at right now and why?
It just depends. I was listening to you guys talk about that on the panel earlier. There's obviously, talk about him picking a woman vice president candidate. They're talking about a woman of, and I won't say color, I hate that term, woman of color. I like to be clear. He's obviously, looking at a black woman like a Senator Harris or a Val Demings, but it really has to come down to strategy. Picking a Kamala Harris really doesn't bring anything as far as California is concerned, because we know that California typically is not in play when we look at the Electoral College. When you look at Val Demings, she comes from the state of Florida. Can she bring that Electoral College? Actually, I know her personally. She was the first person I ever interviewed on my show. And I will say that although she has a lot of popularity in Orlando and Central Florida, it doesn't necessarily mean that she can carry the entire state. There's a big difference from running in a district than the entire state. So he's really going to have to be strategic and look at who would be best. Would it be a Senator Klobuchar who can work in the Midwest? So it just really depends. We can't call it right now.
Do you think there'll be more scrutiny over the VP pick? Because Joe Biden has implied, look, you know, he said, I'm kind of old, I might not be around for another term. So do you think that invokes more scrutiny on whoever his eventual nominee, if he wins the nomination, who the nominee might be?
I think it's going to be more scrutiny, period. If it's Kamala, they're going to say Kamala's a cop. That's going to start all over again. If they pick Stacey Abrams, that's going to start all over again about how she's not a true progressive and how she took money from Bloomberg. So I think just where we are now, remember when Joe Biden just kind of slid by as President Obama's VP, no one really vetted him. That's why a lot of folks are surprised to see the things that he has said in the past that were very offensive, the things that he's done in the past.
What are those comments?
We're saying, well, just like the comments you mentioned, when you talk about how he pushed the crime bill, the things that he said, when he talked about Barack Obama being articulate, when he's talked about clean and articulate, when he's talked about the school busing issue. There's been a number of things that he said that people are like, wow, why did President Obama even pick him in the first place? And that's because last time there wasn't really vetting on the VP. Right. So I think because now that the information is more widely known, that scrutiny is going to automatically come to whoever the VP pick is. There won't be any more sliding in. People actually want to know who the VP will be this time.
All right, Tezalyn, thank you for your analysis. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've got Fox News' Jackie Heinrich, who is live in Cleveland tonight with the Sanders campaign, but not much of a crowd because, as we addressed earlier, that got canceled due to corona concerns. Jackie, what are you hearing and what are you looking for right now?
Yeah, well, Lisa, they hightailed it out of here and went to Burlington, Vermont. Campaign sources are telling me that, Michigan is certainly a blow. You can kind of feel that mood there with the campaign. There's no indication whether Senator Sanders is going to speak tonight. We do have folks on the ground in Burlington ready to go if that happens. But until then, it's just sort of a wait and see. Now, of course, this is not a winner-takes-all kind of thing. The delegate split has not yet been decided. So, how much of a win Biden really gets tonight in these 3 states that have, been decided or projected rather, is yet to be seen. But Sanders obviously wanted to do better, especially in that key state of Michigan. He spent more than 3 times more in just television ads than Biden did in that state. He canceled an event in Mississippi in order to concentrate his resources in Michigan and really build his ground game there. And as I was talking to you earlier in the night, at one point in the evening, they were even commenting on how there were long lines at voting locations, at polling locations, and they were calling on state officials to keep the polling locations open longer if necessary in response to, how long people had to wait. So I'm sure these results coming out, if they're seeing a lot of energy at the polls, are definitely going to be a blow for Sanders' campaign. Now, the other interesting thing that happened tonight, 30-plus Warren campaign staffers did come out and endorse Sanders, and said they wanted to get behind the progressive that they thought was going to be best for the country. These are people that worked with Elizabeth Warren's campaign, not Elizabeth Warren herself, notably. She still has not come out and endorsed anybody. But these were people that, had progressive ideals that wanted to, ahead of this key day where a lot of primaries are happening, let voters know that, people who want a progressive outcome for the nominee are getting behind Sanders. So I'm sure that added a little bit of energy, seeing that endorsement come in, those 30-plus staffers there. But, the losses in Missouri and Mississippi were a little bit more predictable than Michigan. I'm sure Michigan, for that reason, is going to be more of a blow. It was a repeat as what we saw in 2016 in Missouri and Mississippi. Both those states he lost to Hillary Clinton, one by more than the other. But he was expecting or hoping for the same kind of upset victory that he saw in Michigan in 2016, where the polls had him down. He ended up winning. It was a turnaround moment for his campaign, and you just didn't really see that tonight. Lisa?
Well, and Jackie, you had mentioned the Warren staffers endorsing Bernie Sanders. You've got your ear to the ground and, talking to these campaigns. Any rumblings of an Elizabeth Warren endorsement?
No, everyone's really taking a step back and giving her space. Understandably, she ran to be the candidate herself, and you could see in her speech when she dropped out of the race that she was, feeling pretty emotional about that. So no one's really kind of going there.
Got it.
But I think there is at least some anticipation within people that worked for her, wanting to see, some of that energy in that progressive field go behind Sanders. They feel like there has to be some movement. So I think that's why maybe they got out ahead before she even said anything,
right,
and pledged their support in light of the absence from her.
Jackie Heinrich,
Lisa?
live from Cleveland. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon. So, Lincoln, one thing I was thinking about when Jackie was talking about, she prefaced the fact that, look, we don't know what the delegate count looks like after tonight, right? So, I mean, we are, sort of bullish on Biden's chances, obviously, having won these key contests tonight. Does the delegate count, matter much, or is it just simply the fact that Sanders has just suffered so many losses recently?
We don't know what the final delegate count is. We do have a sense of the delegate count. In Michigan, where it's roughly 53 to 40, we know that that's going to be
And just for those at home, real quick, sorry, Lincoln, we've got Biden's at 783, Sanders is 627.
Right, and if you've been watching that on your network over the night, it keeps adding up, so they know how it's not
fluid.
like if you lose 80-15 in Mississippi, roughly speaking, that's a 28-7 delegate split. That means you're 20 delegates. In this case, Biden is 20 delegates ahead, Sanders 20 delegates behind. There's no delegate magic formula that's going to make this a decent night for Bernie Sanders. He lost badly tonight. That will be reflected in the delegate count. He will almost certainly lose by a larger margin overall next Tuesday.
Right.
That will be reflected in the delegate count. There's no magic that's going to save that.
Well, and Tom, a lot of people are disappointed because they were hoping there'd be a brokered convention. All of us political nerds.
Sure.
Everyone's shaking. All of us political nerds. Those are things we want to see because it's just interesting to cover, right? But the likelihood is that's probably not going to happen.
No,
I mean, one of these candidates, probably Joe Biden's going to get a majority, right? +1.
I mean, think about it this way. Even if Bernie had squeaked out a victory in Michigan tonight, like he did 4 years ago, right? That delegate split for a 1.5-point victory was like 26 to 23. He only netted 3 delegates. Even if he had done that tonight, he'd still end up losing overall, and again facing even more losses next week. So it is a math problem for him. And as I said, he needs to change the dynamic. He needs to not just start winning some of these states, squeaking by. He needs to start dominating them. And there's no indication that that's going to happen. And we're seeing Biden really across the board, winning this broad-based support. And I don't see that changing.
Brad, sorry. To Tom's point, looking ahead to next week, you've got contests like Florida, which are, looking pretty good for Joe Biden, a lot of delegates there. Do you see any potential pickup opportunities for Sanders where he could potentially dominate, as Tom just mentioned?
Not tonight.
Or in the next couple of contests?
Only if, and it was picked up on earlier, if there's a meltdown on Biden's part before the cameras in a debate, if Biden completely pulls a Bloomberg, then you could see a mess. And then you can start talking about a brokered convention because the delegates then are fractured. But having said that, if Biden continues on this path, all people hearing tonight is winning states.
Right.
We haven't even gotten to the delegate. That really doesn't matter because it goes to the momentum and the money that's going to be flowing in and the inevitability that people feel. Now, having said that, assuming that it is Biden, it's not going to be a kumbaya moment where Democrats are suddenly going to coalesce with Biden. Quite the opposite. There's going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight at that convention on their platform because that's what Bernie has been running for. If it's not going to be him, he's going to put his signature and his brand on the Democratic platform. And that's going to be a mess. The question for Democrats is, are you going to let us into that process? Are you going to show us how the sausage is being made? Because Biden, when he gives his acceptance speech, is already going to be bound by a platform. And it's going to be fodder for Trump because it is going to be so far left. And then we're going to start putting price tags on every one of those programs.
Well, and I want to get to someone who covers the media because we've got Joe Concha with us, who's a media reporter for The Hill. Hi, Joe. So,
Lisa, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? So what are the headlines?
Is it Lisa Marie or Lisa? I want to make sure I get that right.
I mean, I'll respond to either, but let's go with Lisa for tonight. So, Joe, what do the headlines look like tomorrow morning as we all wake up, when we wake up?
You know what? It's the first time, Lisa, where actually what was supposed to happen happened, right? I mean, we're seeing results that we all kind of expected. And if you looked at the polls going in, Joe Biden had a pretty commanding lead in Michigan. Michigan was the whole ball game tonight. Biden wins that. And now basically the drama has been taken out of this race, because if you look ahead, you know, we talk about inevitability and the fact that Joe Biden has a Cat 4 hurricane at his back at this point. The remaining 5 states that have big delegates, Florida 219, Illinois 155, Ohio 136, New York 274, Pennsylvania 186. You know what those all have in common? Those are states that Bernie Sanders didn't win in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, and he ain't going to win against Joe Biden in 2020. So it's basically all over for Sanders. But here's the thing. He's probably not going anywhere, because if you look back at 2016, he didn't get out of the race until July 26th. Basically right before the convention, 2 months after he was mathematically eliminated on the delegate count. So I look at that, and Bernie's going to stay in here, to everybody's point, and it's a great one, to make sure that he's already pushed the party way to the left. He wants to make sure that his platform is included as much as possible with the convention. That means staying in and being just a headache for Joe Biden, who now has to debate him in Arizona if he stays in the race in front of nobody, while sitting down, by the way. The DNC, they love making up rules as they go along. They say, yeah, Joe, you could sit for 2 hours instead of standing up. But that's where we stand at this point. We know Joe Biden's going to be the nominee. Bernie Sanders probably isn't going to go anywhere. And now the big question is, who's going to be his vice presidential pick at this point?
Who do you think it will be?
You know, I keep warming up to this idea that Hillary Clinton very easily could be the number 2.
Really?
Yeah, and it's a good point by Michael Goodwin.
Which is something we've all been asking for a long time.
He won a Pulitzer with the New York Post. Yeah. Look, Joe Biden, I think the plan all along was for him to be the nominee, right? But this was the plan for, say, the 2012 version of Joe Biden. I went back and watched the vice presidential debate between him and Paul Ryan in that year. Boy, he was sharp. He had a command of the facts. It was like watching a different person. And I think Democrats thought they were going to get that Joe Biden, like Joe Biden in his late 60s. Instead, you have now this late 70s Joe Biden, who is a shell of himself. So now the number 2, the vice presidential pick, becomes very important. And Stacey Abrams, I would have put my money on a while back, but she doesn't have any experience, and she's 0 for 1 in big races. She could carry perhaps Georgia for you. Then there's Kamala Harris, same thing, didn't perform all that well here. So you have to kind of have somebody there who has the experience and that people have the confidence in that she can do the job, and it will be a she, if Joe Biden continues down this road of decline. And Hillary Clinton seems to be the best choice in that regard. I know it sounds a bit crazy, but the more I say it out loud, the more it kind of makes sense. I'd love to hear what the panel has to say, but that's where I'm at there.
So, Joe, you mentioned the debate between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden coming up in Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah. Should Joe Biden show up? If he has a bad debate performance, does it matter for him?
He's already had some pretty bad performances.
If it's even worse,
Oh, it's even worse. Yeah, well, then it looks like he's a coward, right? I think that would look infinitely worse. But you know what actually gives him a respite, as crazy as this sounds, is coronavirus basically shutting down a lot of public events, right? A friend of mine, and I already feel old for saying this, has a kid in college, and that kid is at Bucknell, and Bucknell said, yeah, go on spring break, don't come back, right? And a lot of events now are being canceled. No, well, I don't know. If I'm paying for that, I'm a little bit mad right now. Do I still have to pay the tuition? But the point is that with all these events being canceled, a Biden rally tonight, the Sanders rally tonight, the Arizona debate with no crowd being there whatsoever, that means that Biden probably isn't going to have any rallies, which means his supporters get 7 minutes of their lives back, which is, I guess, a plus. But this is going to kind of give him a respite, Lisa, right, where he doesn't have to really campaign, therefore not make a lot of mistakes. So, yeah, if he shows up to that debate, I would assume that he'll do as well well as he did during the other ones, which is, just okay. And maybe just okay is good enough, because in the end, what we've learned here is that Bernie Sanders' ceiling of, with a socialism platform has a very low ceiling, while people would just prefer Joe Biden because, well, he's basically the only guy left because everybody else left the race, and Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Warren pulled a Jack Ruby on Michael Bloomberg during that debate, taking him out. So that's where we are.
And we kind of heard that from David Axelrod after one of the debates. He said about Joe Biden, the good news is this is the best he can do. The bad news is this is the best he can do. So, Joe Concha, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll
Lisa
check back
Marie,
with you in a bit.
thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.
And now we've got Fox Nation host Tomi Lahren, who is with us. Tomi, so Joe said something, and I've got to get your thoughts on this. So he mentioned that he thinks Hillary Clinton might be the VP candidate. Your thoughts?
Oh, please, please let it be Hillary Clinton. Between the two of them, I'm sure people are going to get very excited. I hope that that's who he picks. I actually think he would do much better with Kamala, and I know that other guests are saying that, of course, she's from California, and they're going to call her Kamala the cop. I do think that she would be a strong choice for Joe Biden because although she is a lot of those things, she is sharp. She does speak well for the most part. She is somewhat relatable, and they could groom her to be a pretty decent vice presidential candidate that could kind of carry Joe Biden through because she is a little bit more stable. So I think that Kamala would be a good choice for Joe.
Really? Do you think? So what's interesting is we've heard Joe Biden, basically admit, look, I'm pretty old. I may only be here for a term. So does that invite additional criticism for the VP pick, potentially like someone like Kamala Harris? Do you think there'll be more scrutiny?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we really need to look towards California as the future of the Democratic Party because this is really their platform that they've tested here is a platform they want to bring nationwide. And I don't know, newsflash, it's not working here, but they're still trying to roll it out nationwide. And I think coming up into the next election, you're going to see people like Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris be really on the forefront, especially Gavin Newsom. Watch that, everyone, because you should be very terrified if that ends up being anywhere near the White House. But I also will say that something that's really striking me when we talk about Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, I think Joe Biden is going to be the nominee. I think he's going to lose to Donald Trump. I'm not really concerned about that. What I'm far more concerned about is these congressional races. And I think we need to be giving a little bit more attention to them as well, because that, if you are confident as I am that Donald Trump is going to be your president and reelected, we really need to look at what our House and our Senate looks like in order to be able to continue our Keep America Great agenda. That's really more where my eye is and what I'm more concerned about right now.
Well, and in talking about that, I mean, look at a state like California, part of what, Democrats picked up a lot of seats in the state of California in the 2018 midterm elections. You talked about some of the policies in California that are failing. Do those play into some of those congressional districts? And what are those policies that you're talking about, just for the viewers at home?
Well, the policies that they want to bring onto the national stage, of course, are gun control, our climate change, our taxation, our regulation, all of the things that are really hampering California right now. And I don't know if you've seen, we have quite a large homeless epidemic right now that's also fueled by lack of leadership. But those are the same things they want to bring onto the national platform. But I will tell you this, when we talk about those congressional seats in California, I cannot stress this enough. Please, everyone, look at the California election system. We just saw it with Super Tuesday last week. We have voter fraud up the wazoo. It is happening in California. It is going to happen in your state. We really need to pay attention to these things. Vote by mail, the motor voter program, ballot harvesting, which is legal here and it's not legal elsewhere, but it is legal here. Those are the things that the Democrats are going to start to implement in other states so they can get an edge, because we know that their policies and their candidates can't do it. So we really need to be mindful of our voter fraud and our election integrity issues. I can tell you, being in California, it's a big problem.
Great. Tomi, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And for those at home, we've seen, Michigan has been called, as you see it up there, Joe Biden right now. And look, we're still getting some of these precincts reporting, so this is very, very early. Mississippi's also been called for Joe Biden, as well as Missouri. We're still waiting on North Dakota, Idaho, and Washington. Washington might take some time because there's a lot of mail-in ballots. Similarly to how we saw California, some of the results still coming in. Washington could end up taking a while. But we're also hearing this. So Bernie Sanders is not going to address anyone tonight. He's not going to be speaking. So, Lincoln, I'm going to bring our panel back in on that. Is that a mistake for Bernie Sanders to not speak tonight?
Well,
It would not be a mistake if he were going back to revisit his plans for the next few months and maybe make an announcement that he's leaving the race tomorrow. But that is not what is going to happen, right? So if he is in this race, yes, he should go probably to Ohio. There is this issue of the coronavirus is not something that's made up. It is a public health issue. But you could do some kind of press availability, something where you're speaking. So I think it is a strategic mistake. We've had a lot of talk, will Sanders leave the race? I think the consensus around this table is that he's not doing it anytime soon. But we should think about that from how this affects the election. Not so much will he leave the race, but how will he leave the race? Because inevitably he will leave the race, whether it's at the convention or earlier. And, I think you're right in that he will try to make a lot of noise at the convention, but at this rate, he's not going to he'd go into that convention with a relatively small number of delegates. And so with 35%, you can't control or influence really the platform.
I disagree. I think that he can cause a lot of trouble whether he has delegates or not.
He made changes in 2016 to the platform.
But he can garner news. The people want to see a catfight right till the end. And Bernie is going to be able to make trouble if Bernie wants to. The question is, what will it take to buy Bernie off, to buy peace with Bernie?
Right, and Bernie isn't that kind of a politician.
Can Bernie convince his troops that they got a good deal?
And the problem is that Bernie's not the kind of politician who makes deals. He doesn't know how to.
But that's the danger.
He needs to, but he doesn't know how to. That's the problem.
But I want to bring Tom into the fold here. So look, we see many times throughout campaign cycles, you look at sort of these strategic mistakes people made. Bloomberg probably was going into the debates, right? He probably should have just sat it out, waited till Super Tuesday and said, hey, look, I'm not playing in South Carolina, I'm not playing in Nevada, so therefore I'm not going to be in the debates. Is not speaking tonight a strategic error for Bernie Sanders? Doesn't it make Joe Biden look even larger that he basically is going to control the airwaves tonight?
It might be, but I don't think it's consequential. It's not like it's going to hurt him terribly. I mean, any more than he's already been hurt by the results tonight. He's not going to be the nominee. I mean, I just don't see any way for him to really turn this thing around. And so the question is, again, how long does he and how does he decide to go out? Is he going to go out in sort of a flame of glory, a blaze of glory, or is he going to try and, be a team player? We don't know the answer to that. I go back to the vice presidential pick. I think Joe, and I like Joe, but I think he's nuts. I don't think it's going to be Hillary Clinton. But I think it's going to be someone like I think Biden's going to go with a woman, but with strategic, and it's going to be Amy Klobuchar or Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan, because that's where this election is going to be decided in those states. I mean, it's going to come down to those same states, and I don't think Biden really needs help with African American voters. He might need some help with Latino voters. He needs some help with young voters, but to have a woman, a Midwestern woman on the ticket to really just basically circle Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and even Minnesota, just keep going in that. I mean, that's essentially what he needs.
Well, and for Gretchen Whitmer, Democrats clearly have their eyes on her. She gave the State of the Union response, so clearly, typically that's reserved for someone who they see as a rising star.
Fresh face.
And Michigan, as you mentioned, a critical state. It was in 2016, again in 2020. So Lincoln, what I find interesting, if it is someone like Gretchen Whitmer, for instance, so Democrats have made a lot of noise about diversity in these primary debates, the need for diversity. That would not be an incredibly diverse ticket in terms of at least, having racial diversity, right? Is that a problem for Democrats?
It's hard to know this far in advance. Whenever you get in this game of who you're going to nominate or who the running mate will be, you're talking between imperfect people.
What are those calculations?
Well, the calculation is one calculation is there a candidate who can bring in a state or a region, right? That's the Klobuchar, that's the Whitmer. They're going to live there in the industrial Midwest. They're going to bring that in. The other is, are they going to bring some kind of balance I desperately need? Now, I tend to agree that Biden doesn't need an African-American to do well with African Americans. He may need an African American to mobilize above and beyond Clinton 2016, which he's going to have to do to win. That's a question to which I don't know the answer. But the other balance here that is overlooked is ideology. Because one way to kind of tamp down what you're calling kind of the Sanders rebellion, if you will, is by bringing in a running mate who does speak to the left of the party. The problem here is that obviously you can't bring in Sanders because he's even older than Biden, right? And Warren, I think, is a natural, but Massachusetts has a Republican governor. So then you're giving up a Senate seat that you desperately need if you want to pass anything if you were elected, President Biden comes into office. So we talk about balance, but there's a lot of ways to look at it, and there's a lot of things to look at in a ticket. The third possibility is what Bill Clinton interestingly did in 1992, which is to double down on who he was. And he went with someone with a very similar profile. We're not going to see that, another career moderate establishment old dude is not going to be on the ticket.
Brad, there's always these discussions, as we're clearly having tonight. One, because it's interesting, and but it really raises the question: do VP picks matter? How much of an influence does it actually have in a general election?
People don't vote for VP. We know that historically. It creates excitement at the convention and gets you out of the convention with a bounce, but then it tends to fade away. And vetting is going to be very, very important, as we all know. As in modern times, it's hard not to know about somebody. So there's a ledger sheet, and I've been involved in conventions, and there's the pros and the cons. First, do no harm. Second, bring something to the table that the candidate himself does not bring. And the third is be an attack dog for the candidate. Are you going to be able to take it to others? And so what you have to do is weigh the pros and cons and then basically go with your gut and make the decision. Having said that,
well,
again,
also, do you like this person? I mean,
likable,
there's personality aspects
and it's got to have, there's got to be a compliment. So at the end of the day, when people go in to vote, they're not thinking of number two, they're thinking about number one. Now, age is a factor. You're going to have to pick somebody who's much younger than Joe Biden. And
well,
Joe
it shouldn't
Biden,
be that hard.
And Joe Biden has said that himself.
Yeah, I know,
but I use the word much younger.
Lincoln, I have this.
Right. So I think that's what they're going to need to do.
Well, we share that, unfortunately. Sorry, guys.
I just have one historical note here, which is significant. The parallel, and this is, excuse me for sounding like an academic here, but there is a parallel here to 1944. And the reason, I'm sorry, that sounds funny, but the reason that the 1944 Democratic Convention was held towards the end of World War II, as you know, and the insiders in the party knew how sick FDR was. And they knew there was no way he was lasting another 4 years. So they had to pick a president. And there was a very, very intense fight between Henry Wallace, who represented what today would be kind of the Sanders wing of the party, and Harry Truman, and Truman won. And this time, I think a lot of people are going into this thinking the VP very well could be the president in a few years.
So does Biden take the one-term pledge, though, and say, look, I'm not going to...
No.
But Tom, does that help him if he does, or does it hurt him? How does that end up playing out, you think, in a general election?
I don't know that hurts him. I think it might actually, for the folks who are concerned about his age and his mental acuity, if he says, look, and he's already basically said something like this, which is, hey, he's recognized I'm an old guy, I'm not going to be around. And if you pick someone who's young and he basically says, look, I'm gonna step away. I mean, most of the rationale for his candidacy is just to beat Donald Trump. That's what people want. That's what they're vesting in him to do. And once he's done that, as Lincoln said, people don't even really know what he stands for other than that. Right? And so if he's able to accomplish that, he will have, in his mind, saved the country from another 4 years of Donald Trump, and then he can sort of pass it off to somebody else.
But that's exactly why I think he's going to lose, is you can't hate Donald Trump out of office. You got to stand for something.
Plus
you got to have something.
Well, and Tom, I want to ask you, so in election cycles, sometimes we see the battlegrounds shift, right? Like, for instance, Ohio, typically a key battleground state, kind of became less of one in 2016 because, Trump won it pretty handily. Does Joe Biden shift the dynamics again for the 2020 map? Or what does the 2020 map look like if it's Joe Biden versus Donald Trump?
It's exactly the same as the 2016 map. There are 10 states in play. They were all decided by 4 points or less. We all know which ones they are. And there have been changes. I mean, remember, Missouri was the big bellwether. That's gone. Ohio's no longer in play. Virginia's no longer in play for Republicans. And so you do have, it basically comes down to the same 10 states, and Joe Biden does not change that equation one bit.
Well, and I want to get Joe Concha back in here as well. Joe, I know you've been standing, do we have Joe? Okay, there we go. Joe, I know you've been standing by on the edge of your seat listening to how exciting we are and how interesting our conversation is tonight. What are your big takeaways from the night?
Biden takes command, obviously, but we knew that was going to happen, so it's not that grippy of a headline. From tonight, I honestly think that, look, everything feels smaller now a little bit on the political scale because of coronavirus dominating our news cycle, and perhaps rightly so. And then I look ahead to the fall, and the economic impact of coronavirus, and how will that benefit or hurt the candidates that are in. And obviously, it's going to probably hurt the incumbent to a certain extent, because we could be looking at negative growth because of all these industries and all these businesses that are being impacted. And if you get 2 straight quarters of negative growth, as you know, then you're looking at a recession. And then I look back at the last 40 years and I see 2 presidents, only 2 incumbents that have been voted out of office after their first term: Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush. What they both had in common was they were both presiding over recessions. And if you take away President Trump's economic argument that the economy is going great, and that Gallup poll that came out last month that said 6 in 10 Americans after 3 years say they're better off than they were 3 years ago, Biden really had no clear argument to counter that, particularly if he's going to raise taxes. But now this whole coronavirus thing seems to throw a big curveball into everything that we're talking about, and it's the unknown of where it's going to go over the next couple of months and the economic impact it's going to have as a result, of course, the human toll that we're talking about as well. So for us to kind of talk about all this stuff and speculate where we're going to be when we get to the fall, I think that's something like we've never seen before in American politics, in terms of an event that we don't know how it's going to end up and who it's going to impact most, particularly the incumbent president, who a month ago looked like he was well on his way to re-election, going against either a socialist or a declining Joe Biden with a strong economy at his back. Now we don't know what's going to happen. I know I shouldn't say that in, in the cable news business, because you have to be definitive, but I honestly don't know.
No, it's an interesting point. And again, those dynamics could shift once again before the general election, too, because we don't know what the lifespan of corona looks like. So you're right. There's so many unknown variables that we simply do not have the answers to. Also, Joe, if I have to cut you off for another Joe, it's because we're expecting Joe Biden to speak here soon, so it's not, it's not intentional there. But Joe, so you mentioned obviously Corona, not just with the economic angle of it, but it's also changing the dynamics of the campaign trail. Talk a little bit about that, of how we're seeing the coronavirus shift just campaigning.
Sure. I thought you said you were going to bring in Joe Rogan instead of me for a second. I was going to get excited
another
about
Joe,
that.
another Joe Biden. You might have heard of him. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, I've heard of him, definitely. So how does it affect the campaign? Well, boy, without being able to hold campaign rallies, then suddenly, how do you really campaign? I guess it'll be a lot of social media, which, obviously has become a thing, particularly since 2016. But it definitely benefits Joe Biden, because he just a couple days ago, a 7-minute stump speech. I mean, Single Me used to go on 8-minute dating, and I guess that was longer. Didn't go well either, by the way. Just want to say that didn't work out for me too well. But the point is to limit a candidate to 7 minutes when you see the guy you want to beat and you want to unseat, and President Trump going 90 minutes, 100 minutes at these rallies, that looks obviously like they're trying to minimize his gaffes as much as possible. And then obviously the debates, I mean, to watch a debate where there's no crowd there reacting to that zinger that you practiced for the past week, that'll be I think I might enjoy it on some level, because the crowd has become distracting during these debates, particularly during this primary season. So to see 2 guys go at it without any crowds interrupting and the applause lines and everything, I think that could be compelling and probably would favor Bernie Sanders, Lisa.
Well, but you look at, too, I mean, so the financial aspect, right? So if they're not on the campaign trail, if they're not doing these rallies, then, there's somewhat a reliance on some of the paid media. Joe Biden has struggled to raise money so far. Bernie Sanders is a pretty large war chest. How does that impact things?
It will, to a certain extent, but again, I mean, with Bernie Sanders, if I could look at some states that have some delegates where he could actually make an impact going forward, then I'd say, okay, well, this thing isn't over yet, because you look at the delegate count, and what is it? It's not even more than 200 delegates does Joe Biden have than Bernie Sanders. But again, when you have Florida, Illinois, Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania that have hundreds of delegates that are all probably going to go to Joe Biden, then the drama is taken out of this thing at this point. And the only question is, will Bernie Sanders wait again until late July to drop out, because the Democratic Party won't be happy about that? But then again, Bernie Sanders is probably like, you know what, screw you. The way you've treated me over the last 2 elections, I'm not here to really benefit this party, particularly when I'm actually an independent anyway. So he'll probably just stay in just to be a craw in the Democratic Party's side and to get what he wants in terms of a platform.
So as we're waiting for Joe Biden to come out and speak tonight, do you think he goes out there and says this race is over? And does that benefit him if he does?
would think No, I don't. I think in normal circumstances, perhaps you would say, maybe it's time for Bernie Sanders to step aside, but I think you let the surrogates do that. And obviously people in the media that'll be screaming about that tomorrow, that Bernie absolutely has to get out. But you need those Bernie Sanders supporters, at least some of them anyway, to come into your camp. And I think what happened with Hillary Clinton was that she angered Bernie Sanders supporters, anger they've carried with them for 4 years, the Bernie bros. And as a result, she didn't have that left flank of the party really solidly behind her. And come to think, what would have happened if she was able to consolidate those Bernie supporters in 2016? Does that get her 77,000 votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which would have made her president? Yeah, maybe. So he has to be very careful, Joe Biden does, and his surrogates for that matter, not to push Bernie Sanders too hard here or make demands, because that will mean his supporters stay home when November comes around.
Joe Concha, thank you.
Lisa, love the earrings, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just got them, so I appreciate it. I've worn them numerous times, but yeah, thank you, Joe. But Tom, also Jill Stein was also sort of a spoiler in states like Michigan, Wisconsin as well. So I mean, it wasn't specifically just the Bernie people not supporting Hillary.
It wasn't, and it was Hillary's inability to really sort of turn out African American votes in those states and replicate Obama's coalition. We talked about these states that are going to be in play. I mean, if you look at the electoral map, right, and you start with 2016, and you look at Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Trump can lose 2 of the 3 and still win. That's right. And in one of the scenarios, I think it is if he wins Michigan and loses the other 2, it's a 269 tie. So I think it's going to be, even with Joe Biden, I think it's going to be a close race. I think it's going to be a hard fought, and we know how Trump campaigns. It's going to be a lot of nastiness, and it's going to be concentrated in those states.
Yeah, I mean, Lincoln, we've seen Joe Biden in the debates, right? It leaves it's not very good, right? He's not a very strong debater. At least he hasn't been this cycle. How does that play out? How do you foresee that playing out in a general election debates?
Well, I think he's fine in a debate. I think that's the least of his problems. I think Donald Trump does a very poor job of persuading voters during the debates. The persuasion game for Donald Trump is going to be the commercials and the social media. Not the rallies are for the base, the personal appearances are for the base. And in fact, the best thing Donald Trump could do for those persuasive voters would be to run a Rose Garden campaign, but he's not going to do that. So I think the debates, Biden's not a great debater, Trump is a very erratic debater, so those I consider a wash. I think I keep going back to this question of you said we know how Trump campaigns. We don't really know how Biden campaigns, despite the fact that we've been doing it on and off for 30-odd years. We get a sense, someone referred to the kind of touchy-feely campaigning style, and we'll leave that on the
sometimes a little too much.
But Trump, Biden is his political style is somebody who wants those
small. What's his message?
I think his message is, and I think it's the best message, his message is, as you suggested, we're going to go back to something normal here. And there are an extraordinary amount of Americans who don't believe what we are experiencing now is normal. And you can hold that thought in your head and think the economy's doing pretty well. Like, those are not mutually exclusive. And then where you come down on that question decides how you vote.
But Brett, okay, so let's carry on that conversation, Brad. So, you've got Joe Biden. He called a voter fat. He threatened him to a push-up contest. He's, yelled at voters. Is that normalcy? Is that a return to normal? Will voters see it that way?
No, and I think, to your point, with Trump, it's a balance between rhetoric versus results. There are people who say, I wish he was nicer or more quote-unquote presidential, but you certainly can't argue with results. He is delivering.
So how does he get that across? Is it paid advertising? Is it paid advertising, or how does he get that across?
No, I think by advertising, reminding the American people where we were and then where we are and where we're going. And the fact is that he's under-promised and over-delivered, and go back to what he did promise in 2016 and tick off his accomplishments. I mean, I get their emails from the White House every day in the campaign. His accomplishments are voluminous. And then you go back and match it up with his promises. So I think, again, when people go into that voting booth, they ask themselves, am I better off today than I was for tomorrow? But also, here's a problem with Biden. Be careful about too much attraction to Obama. Because if Obama goes out there, people are going to say, I love Obama. I wish we had somebody like Obama. Because Joe Biden is no Obama. And I think that's the danger of having Obama out there with Joe Biden, because it's night and day.
Is that a danger?
I think it's a slightly different danger, because you don't have to, because Obama can be used very strategically. It's a little different way I see it. The way I see it is this. People, particularly Democrats, but also generally, they love Obama. But when you ask them what they love about Obama, policy-wise, other than the Affordable Care Act, which is obviously fodder for much controversy and dispute, there's not much, right? But I think Biden is past that now. That was a primary problem. It's not a general election problem.
So I find that interesting you just mentioned that, Tom, because we've seen with some of these policies, though, with Obama, particularly in the midterm elections, I mean, Democrats saw historic losses under President Obama in the midterm elections, which really did come down to less of the personality, because when the personality was on the ballot, Democrats did great in the general elections. When the issues were on the ballot in the midterms, Democrats got crushed. So if that's the concern, if the issues resurface with President Obama, that's what Joe Biden is. He is a continuation of the Obama policies. So how does that play out in a general election, and does that end up mattering?
I don't know. I mean, it's tough. I mean, you know, Trump has the same problem, right, in 2018, particularly in the House, not so much in the Senate, right? He was not able, and he campaigned his butt off for Republicans around the country, and he basically, you know, couldn't generate any sort of coattails. I do think. Look, Joe Biden's general election strategy has to be that he has to play on this idea that he's going to win over these voters, right, and reconnect with a lot of these voters that Trump won. They have Democratic DNA. They had voted for Obama in 2008 or 12 or both. Can he reconnect with them and draw at least some of them back in, enough of them to win those states that matter?
Interesting. All right. Well, we're going to ask Tomi Lahren that question because we have Tomi here as well. So, you know, Tomi, what do you think? What is Joe Biden's message heading into a general election?
His message, and his only message, is I'm not a socialist and I'm not Donald Trump. That's it. That's all he has. If you listen to him in the debates, he never really articulates any plans or policies, how he's going to pay for anything. He wants to appear as though he's the moderate by going against some of the Medicare for all ideas. But at the end of the day,
and Tomi, sorry, I've got
to.
Tomi, sorry, I've got to stop you right now because we have the former Vice President Joe Biden speaking right now. Let's go to him.
The corner, and these are all people who have been working like the devil to try to get us elected as the. So I want to thank my sister Valerie and my son-in-law, Dr. Howard Kreiner, here. And folks, look, we were planning a big rally in Cleveland tonight, but the governor of Ohio asked the presidential campaigns to cancel their indoor public events in Cleveland with large crowds of people. And that's what we did due to the coronavirus, and he was concerned about that. And as I've said all along, that we would follow the guidance of the CDC, state and local officials, and public health officials with respect to our campaign events. And we'll continue to do that. This whole coronavirus issue is a matter of presidential leadership. And later this week, I'll be speaking to you on what I believe the nation should be doing to address this virus. But tonight, I want to speak to you from Philadelphia, where we announced our campaign at the front end, where we did our final announcement. To all those who have been knocked down, to all those who have been counted out, left behind, this is your campaign. Just over a week ago, many of the pundits declared that this candidacy was dead. Now we're very much alive. Although there's a way to go, it looks like we're going to have another good night. With victories in Mississippi, Missouri, Michigan, and we're waiting to hear from North Dakota, Idaho, and Washington State. As I said from the beginning, this election is the one that has character on the ballot. The character of the candidates, the character of the nation is on the ballot. It's more than a comeback, in my view, our campaign. It's a comeback for the soul of this nation. This campaign is taking off, and I believe we're going to do well from this point on. Take nothing for granted. Want to earn every single vote in every single state. But if you're willing, if you want to join us, go to joebiden.com. Sign up. Sign up, volunteer, and contribute if you can. We need you, we want you, and there's a place in our campaign for each of you. And I want to thank Bernie Sanders and his supporters for their tireless energy and their passion. We share a common goal, and together we'll defeat Donald Trump. We'll defeat him together. We're going to bring this nation together. We're regenerating a Democratic base, the Democratic Party, the African-American community, high school educated folks like the ones I grew up with in Claymont, not far from here. In my old neighborhood, labor, suburban women, veterans, firefighters, union members, and so many more. People of every economic station. The poor who are struggling, and they are struggling in this environment. The middle class who worries about whether or not they're going to be able to hang on and stay there, maintain their economic security. They're the reason Jill and I got involved in this campaign in the first place. And they're the reason why I became a Democrat so long ago. And I can't tell you, I really mean this from the bottom of my heart, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the confidence they've shown in me thus far and the way they turned out to vote for me. In my first campaign, when I was a kid, a long time ago, I had a billboard that said one thing on it. It had a picture of my wife and children, and it said, "For all our families." That's all it was, for all our families. That included Democratic families, families of independent voters, Republican families, everyone of every stripe, for all our families. And look, that's what we were able to accomplish in South Carolina. That's what we did on Super Tuesday. And it appears, although it's a little premature, it appears that's what we're able to do tonight.
All right, well, you were just listening to Joe Biden speak there with his wife, Jill, by his side. Big, big night for Joe Biden tonight, winning Michigan, Missouri, Mississippi have all been called. We are still waiting North Dakota, Washington, and Idaho. I want to bring Tomi Lahren back in here. Tomi, sorry about that. We had to, cut you short there for a minute to get the vice president, former vice president in. So just to recap some of the things he had said, he said he's going to address the coronavirus in the coming days. He said he was declared dead, but his campaign is very much alive. He said that character is on the ballot this November, and he is looking to win over middle-class voters. What are your thoughts on having just listened to Joe Biden?
All we hear from Joe Biden is fluff and him attempting to stay on track. That's what you hear from a Joe Biden speech, and in really any capacity. If he's not making a huge gaffe, he's just giving you fluff. But to go back to your question you asked me before he started speaking, I think that just reinforced it. He doesn't have plans and policies. Think about it. What is he going to do for health care? He just thinks Obamacare was the gold standard, which we know was a failure. So that's what he wants to do with health care. We know what he wants to do with guns. He's going to make Beto O'Rourke his gun czar. What is he going to do with immigration? He really hasn't been pushed on what he's going to do with immigration. If he's an open borders candidate or if he does believe in border security, hasn't been pressed on it. He talks about climate change. He just says, oh, well, we need to get rid of fossil fuels. We need to, eliminate those, eliminate coal, eliminate those high-paying jobs and wonderful industries that employ so many of those middle Americans he talks about. So at the end of the day, all you have is the anti-Trump candidate and the anti-socialist candidate filled with a lot of fluff, but not a lot of solutions for the American people, not a lot of solutions he's willing to outline. We know Bernie Sanders is pretty forthright about, I'm going to raise your taxes. This is what I believe in, going after the billionaires. I believe in a democratic socialist revolution. But what does Joe Biden believe in? I don't think we really know, other than the fact that he was President Obama's vice president. It's about all we have.
Well, and Tomi, you mentioned fossil fuels, and I don't think this really gets discussed enough. I mean, we addressed it a little bit on the panel earlier tonight. But that matters. I mean, you look at Democrats are trying to win back some of these Rust Belt states. If you're looking at places in the Midwest, eliminating fossil fuels matters. That's jobs, that's industries that you're talking about killing. Talk a little bit more about that and the importance there.
Well, and beyond just the jobs and the industries that it's killing, you're also killing industries that rely on those industries. North Dakota is a great example of that, which we're still awaiting the results from. But that's an area that's been touched by the shale oil revolution, that's been touched by fracking, that has not only had those people come into that state with great high-paying jobs, but has really been really a job creator for a lot of the other industries and the service industries that have surrounded those other industries. But beyond that, when we're talking about a pandemic, is what we're talking about with the coronavirus right now, we have to look at independence, economic independence, fuel independence, and that's what the fracking revolution and the shale oil revolution has allowed for us because of Donald Trump's actions and his deregulations here in the United States. So when you have a candidate like Joe Biden that's preaching this climate change revolution, you're going to be killing industry, but you're also going to be making us less independent. That's not what we need right now, especially with what's going on in the rest of the world.
And Tomi, before we bring it back to the panel, any last final thoughts for the viewers at home?
Once again, you saw Joe Biden do very well. They're going to call it a comeback. He's been propped up, so I don't think Democrats should get too excited about this. I think that they should be very concerned. And I think President Trump, as long as he keeps doing what he's doing and he keeps speaking to his supporters and his base, I think you're going to see Donald Trump cruising in with another victory. But I will say we need to pay more attention to these congressional races because that's what's going to be very important to us going into this next election.
Tomi, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
So I want to bring it back to the panel now. Tomi had mentioned some of the congressional races, which is important, right? Republicans obviously hope to retake the House. You look at the Senate is very much in play for Democrats as well. So a lot of Republicans were hoping Bernie Sanders would end up being the nominee because they're hoping that puts additional races in play that might not otherwise have been. What does Joe Biden mean for the down ballot for Democrats?
Well, I think he's going to be helpful. I mean, I do think Bernie represented real problems for the Democrats in some of these states and some of these congressional districts. So I think, and we've seen the polling coming out recently has looked very good for the Democrats in places like Maine and other places. So I think that's a plus. Just real quickly on Biden's speech, what we saw from him, that's a man who knows he's won.
Yeah.
Right? He was saying, hey, I'd like to thank Bernie and his supporters, and we want to bring you along. He was a guy, he knows this is over, barring some catastrophic event, and he's going to work to, I thought he was actually very good. He was on prompter, and he did pretty well scripted, and that's the message that he's got to send. Not only it was a cleaning up the primary, finishing off the primary, and moving into general election mode.
Lincoln?
Well, I very much agree. I would say about these congressional races, one thing you saw in the last few weeks is that I want to look at Montana for a second, where Steve Bullock, who had been kind of maybe running, maybe not running, decided to run. I think that's because he thought Biden would be on top of the ticket. For people who were looking at these Senate races for a while, and regardless of who you support in the primary, there was always a lot of data that suggested Biden was better on top of the ticket. You don't want to go in on the Senate, have Sanders on the top of the ticket and lose because of that. But right now, Colorado, Maine, Montana, these are looking good for the Democrats. Alabama is still going to be, where Doug Jones has to win that kind of unusual situation, is still going to be a tough one. Briefly on Biden's speech, what struck me, I mean, this was not great rhetoric, but it was solid. If you will, a double up the middle, not a home run. But that's when Americans talk about normalcy. That's what they want. They want to look at the president's speech and then go over to the sports highlights or something, and not have to react to it, not have to get angry, not have to pretend they're watching some kind of WW wrestling kind of situation. Pardon me for not knowing exactly what the wrestling situation is.
Well, I know because my brother used to watch it, and then he would jump off the couch and clothesline.
I read baseball books, not wrestling books.
It's an unfortunate familiarity with it, but it brings back some negative memories. But we'll shift back to the 2020 race from there. Brad, what do you make of what you heard from Joe Biden, and where do things head now?
Joe Biden's very good when he's scripted. And the problem with Joe Biden is when he's unscripted and when you're going to see him at debates. It's one thing to debate a primary opponent. It's another thing to debate Donald Trump. So I think playing it safe for Joe Biden, he thinks is his game plan. It's not going to work. And he's going to be in much different territory when we head into the general election. Tonight, presumptive nominee, no question. He took command of this part of the race. And Bernie's in the bunker. What happens when Bernie pops out? What's he going to say?
And we will all be watching for that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone for being with us tonight. That does it for us tonight. Thank you so much to my panel for their analysis. And be sure to tune in again next Tuesday for can't miss reaction to the next round of the primaries on March 17th. And if you aren't a member of Fox Nation, now is the time to sign up. Right now, you can get the first month for just 99 cents. Just log on to our website or your app store to download and start streaming on your phone, tablet, or smart TV. I am Lisa Boothe. Thank you so much for watching, and good night from New York City.